If you haven't heard the word porpoising, then you haven't been watching Formula One. It's pretty much the biggest issue in the racing world this year, but there's a new rule that the FIA announced to tackle it. Today, we'll be talking about what such a change looks like for the teams, especially the smaller ones. To be specific, what disaster it could be for them. First up, the porpoising issue and how it impacts drivers. When you think of an F1 car, you don't necessarily think about it bouncing around like crazy, because it's not supposed to do that, like at all. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's been happening with the 2022 build of F1 cars, and it's become a serious problem for almost all the teams. After several complaints from drivers of different teams, plus drivers that were visibly impacted like Lewis Hamilton, the FIA realized pretty quickly that porpoising could lead to serious crashes if not dealt with immediately. And it's no secret that the newest features of the cars are to blame for this recipe for disaster. Some of these unique changes include increased ground effect aerodynamics, which restarted the high-frequency bouncing problem in the cars, especially when being driven at high speeds. This means the cars run super low to maximize the ground effect, along with making the vehicle stiffer than before. And though most of the teams were trying their best to control it, teams like Mercedes were suffering. Lewis Hamilton, for starters, had such severe back pain and bruising that he was struggling to get out of his car. Naturally, this caused outrage within the F1 teams, and the issue was raised in the Technical Advisory Committee, aka the forum where the F1 teams themselves discuss changes to the technical elements of their cars in this case. But the proposal to change the build of the cars didn't exactly get overwhelming support. Now for the FIA's explanation of the changes they're making to the rules. Now, however, the FIA has intervened, so no teams have a say in changing their decision. Probably a good thing, though there's no denying this will misbalance the competitive order of the teams. Teams like Mercedes and Ferrari getting the shorter end of the stick, and teams like Red Bull are at an advantage since they're the only team who never had a porpoising problem. Just in case you're not caught up, the race in Baku was kind of the final nail in the coffin for the F1 drivers. It was exceptionally brutal, to say the least, with Lewis Hamilton's back pain being the most jarring piece of evidence. So, after the race, the FIA's single-seater technical director, Nicholas Tombasis, sent a technical directive to all the teams, laying out the plan for the foreseeable future. Of course, the TDs are never officially published, so we'll give you a rundown of their explanation. Before anything else, immediate car changes are to be made. The main reason porpoising has been persistently incurable is the increased downforce in the cars, which makes it extra difficult for teams to maintain a balanced aero platform. Some teams suffered from the floor edges flexing downwards at higher speeds, which made the downforce levels even higher. This was the specific issue that led to the preseason decision to allow teams to run a single floor stay. Next up, the two new measures. So the FIA decided they'll introduce two more measures to help the teams make their floors stronger. An additional stay mounted further forwards of the one the cars already have, an additional thickness on the top surface of the floor. Doesn't matter if it breaks local rules on the curvature of the car or extends beyond the defined volumes in the regulations. And if these changes make an obvious difference to the porpoising issue, then a formal rule change would be proposed. Another thing the FIA wanted to gather over the Canadian Grand Prix was whether a car could be likely to bounce or exhibit excessive vertical accelerations. This is something they decided would be analyzed by inspecting the wear patterns on cars, and then the ways some teams have reduced their skid wear. And now, for the porpoising metric. Not only that, but the FIA hoped to construct an aerodynamic oscillation metric to help determine if cars are bouncing too much, and if yes, then which ones. This is something they'd do by using the sensor fitted into the cars near their center of gravity. The said sensor would measure their vertical acceleration and consequently help them pull together an AOM, with the maximum limit that cars should not be exceeding. Then they decided that the teams would be requested to calculate the AOMs of their own cars over 3 consecutive laps during a final free practice session, and any laps that weren't executed at racing speed would be nullified. Last but not least, the only exceptions to this change would be raising the car up and adjusting it for cooling if there were a change in the weather, plus tire pressure changes or adjusting the front wing flap angle. Pretty reasonable if you ask us. It gets better though. If a team couldn't construct a car setup that meets the metric, then they'd be asked to create a setup with the lowest AOM possible, then raise the ride height by 10 millimeters. What's more is that there's a penalty the teams would face for not complying with the AOM. If the cars bounce too much or go beyond the limits, then they'd be at risk for disqualification from an event. Yup, this is part of the 2022 F1 technical regulations. A vehicle whose construction can be dangerous can be excluded by the stewards. Sheesh. But these are all short-term changes. What about permanent ones? Even if the AOM and the requirement for the teams to adhere to it isn't successful, the FIA has pretty much reached their limit. They're determined to make better rules starting next year onwards, and of course, eradicating the porpoising problem is at the top of their list. Tombasis expressed in a statement that they'd be looking into other options. Different geometries like raising the floor edges, reducing the floor platform, discarding the front edge wing, and so forth are all changes that could be made to get rid of the issue. So it's pretty clear the FIA isn't playing around anymore, especially now that they've planned discussions with the technical directors and the teams to come up with changes for next year. They are already gearing up for how to solve the problem, and we're sure all the teams are overjoyed, or so you think. And finally, the teams that haven't taken the rule change very well. All that glitters isn't gold, and the smaller teams in the F1 certainly have the short end of the stick with this one. To put it simply, anyone with eyes can tell that constructing an F1 car takes a truck ton of time and money. Even altering the cars to adhere to new regulations is no small feat, and Red Bull's Christian Horner thinks there's no need for them to do so. After all, Red Bull hasn't experienced any porpoising all year. He expressed the need for a sensible solution, saying it was too late in the season to make fundamental regulation changes. According to him, only one team has had problems with porpoising, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out he means Mercedes. It's not just Red Bull though. There are reportedly at least 5 teams that are opposed to the changes, and for similar reasons, they're being implemented too late into the season. At this point in the year, most teams have already begun their construction of next year's vehicles, but now that the FIA and the constructors have been negotiating, development is currently on hold. And how do smaller teams feel about this change? This is bad news for smaller teams in particular. Not only is it insanely expensive to reconstruct vehicles, but most small teams carry over their chassis from the previous season onto the next to save money. With these new changes, they'll have to redesign and make new ones. AlphaTauri's Guillaume Desauteux agrees, saying it's too late to modify some designs because they're set to be released in the next few weeks. And he's not wrong either. The whole project is interlinked, and changing one parameter impacts the rest of the vehicle. Alfa Romeo, one of the smallest teams in the F1, will probably suffer the most. Being forced to redo their chassis would have a massive impact on their performance in 2023, especially since they were planning to carry a lot of their vehicle's elements into next year's designs. On top of that, the cost cap is dropping by another $5 million, so the smaller teams are under ridiculous amounts of pressure. All we're saying is, don't be surprised if you see protests against the new regulations. It's not exactly fair for teams with a lesser budget. But the newest FIA report reveals some very concerning aspects. There are apparently potentially deadly impacts on the drivers because of porpoising. Yep, you heard that right. According to Toto Wolff from Mercedes, 1 to 2 hertz of frequency sustained by a driver over a few hours could lead to actual brain damage. And if that's not bad enough, Mercedes drivers have been sustaining 6 to 7 hertz of frequency for over 7 hours at a stretch. Well, it's no surprise Mercedes is at the forefront of the porpoising movement. Some teams still aren't convinced though. Ferrari's racing director Laurent Michels thinks the FIA needs to make better judgments before wreaking havoc and changing the rules. What he's overlooking, however, is that this isn't a lapse in judgment. Redesigning the vehicles is the one solution to such a problem. If you remember clearly, the last time a change like this took place was when the Halo was introduced, and there's no doubt it saved several lives. So maybe, just maybe, we should trust the experts on this one again. That's a wrap for this video. What do you think about the newest rule change? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.